Well, we do have 3 chapters to make it through this morning. 2 of them are kind of long. There's a lot of action going on in here, though, so I guess we need to go ahead and get started. Eric, would you open us with a word of prayer, please, sir?
Heavenly Father, I thank you for today. Thank you for the weather. Thank you for the words that you're bringing to them, and the worship that I'm listening to your heart and thing. Hear what he's learned and what he's studied, so that we can keep it, use it to glorify you, and you honor you today.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, we're going to start in on Genesis 40 today, and I'm going to go ahead and read verses 1 through 8 to get us into it. Then it came about after these things, the cupbearer and the baker for the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was furious with his 2 officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. So he put them in confinement in the house of the captain of the bodyguard, in the jail, the same place where Joseph was imprisoned. The captain of the bodyguard put Joseph in charge of them, and he took care of them. And they were in confinement for some time. Then the cupbearer and the baker for the king of Egypt, who were confined in jail, both had a dream the same night, each man with his own dream, and each dream with his own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning and observed them, behold, they were dejected. He asked Pharaoh's officials who were with him in confinement in his master's house, "Why are your faces so sad today?" Then they said to him, "We have had a dream, and there is no one to interpret it." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell it to me, please." So in verse 1, it came about after these things. What are these things? I wasn't here for the last part of the lesson last week. I had to go get the communion trays ready. So what were these things?
Probably would have been the activity with Potiphar's wife. It's that's on stage last week, but after he's put in prison, hearing his wife's story, Potiphar was furious.
Right.
So after all that happened, that
kind of look at Joseph here. Joseph is a shepherd, out tending his flock, and his brothers come along and plot to kill him, and instead they sell him into slavery. And he ends up in Egypt, and he's working there in the house of Pharaoh. He's got a really good job, and then Pharaoh's wife unjustly accuses him of attempted rape, and he ends up in prison. And so that's where he is now. Those are these things. Joseph's not having a very, very good time, I wouldn't think. But he's still holding on to his faith. He's still believing in God. Okay? Now, the cupbearer in verse 1 is the verb used there sometimes is translated butler, and the Aramaic translation tells us it's chief cupbearer. This is a very high office, a very trusted position. This is the guy that he's a food taster. He's the guy that makes sure there's no poison in the cup and no poison in the food that's fed to Pharaoh. This is one of Pharaoh's top guys. Okay. He's on the front line looking for any plots that are out there. He's a court confidant. He's kind of like Pharaoh's secret service kind of guy. Okay, he's in that position. Kind of like a culinary bodyguard. I mean, think about it. What's the easiest way to get to a ruler back in those days? Poison them. That's the easiest way. It can be done under the radar, and you don't get caught. With the food situation and standards back then, it was probably pretty easy to poison food and drink. Probably wouldn't have taken too much. You find some berries or something, squeeze them out into the drink, and boom, he's on. So the baker, who's the baker? Well, he's another important person. Found out in my readings this week that at this time in Egypt, there had been identified is weird. 38 kinds of cakes, which were regularly baked, as well as 57 types of breads. Okay, it's like you go into the deli or the bakery at any of these stores here, and you've got all the different kinds of breads and all. They had that in Egypt at that time. That's a lot of variety. It really amazed me for that time. I mean, we're talking thousands a year full Christ, and they had that variety in their breads. That's amazing, in my opinion. So this baker fellow, he's a pretty important guy, because he's got to keep track of all these different recipes, how to do things. And they also use dyes and stuff to change the colors of the breads, and they bake it in physical shapes for different festivals and stuff. And I mean, this guy was he was up there in the esteem of the king.
Kind of grants a new respect for what Gulf Adventure does, isn't it?
Yeah, really, absolutely. There's a really hard hand to
keep track of.
Yeah. So I was doing, they offended Pharaoh. Now, what in the world could they have done to offend Pharaoh? Well, I did some further reading and some accounts of the time, and the word offended used here is interesting. It's to miss the mark, to miss a goal, to go wrong. And gosh, that's kind of how today we term sin. What's it mean to sin? It means to miss the target. It means to go wrong, which I thought was interesting. So something happened either to the quality of the food or the drink, or maybe they weren't given the right advice, or maybe they weren't giving any advice to Pharaoh because they were members of his court. There's this fellow Rashi, who was a Jewish commentator in the Middle Ages, and his position was that regarding the cupbearer, that they had found a fly in the wine, and regarding the baker, they found a pebble in the king's bread. And the king, the Pharaoh, he just flipped out. Said, this is unacceptable. To the dungeon. And there they went. The verb used for furious there in 2, that's a verb that is often used in conjunction with referring to God's wrath or God's anger. And we need to remember that Pharaoh was seen as a god. He was part of the sun god group. He was Re, part of Re's group, Re, the sun god. So this is a very strong word used here. Pharaoh was really angry. So he put him in confinement in the house of the captain of the bodyguard. That's Potiphar's house. And Potiphar's chief jailer had put Joseph in charge. Now Joseph at this time, he was still in prison. He possibly at this time, when he first entered, he had been in fetters. He had ropes around him and stuff to hold him in. This is a political kind of jail. This is where the political prisoners were, if it has been suggested. And the fact that Joseph is in charge of it would indicate that this is a political jail for the political prisoners. It's not your common thieves and whatever. These are for your high-ranking officials, kind of like federal prisons are now versus the state prisons that we have in the United States. So anyway, Joseph's put in charge of these 2 guys, and these guys had dreams, and it's at this point that we get to see that Joseph has a gift. He has a gift of interpretation. It's also noted that when God is trying to get messages to the non-Abrahamic people, he often used dreams to get messages to them. With his people, he often used visions, but with the non-Abrahamic peoples, he often used dreams. And of course, when you have a dream, you seek an interpretation of it. And so Joseph came to these guys in the morning. Evidently, he was out of his fetters by this time. He was free to move around. he really cared about these men. You know, he saw they were dejected. So he says, man, what's going on, fellas? You know, what's going on? And they tell him the dreams, and then, you know, in verse 8, we find out that Joseph reveals his worldview. You know, that God is in control, God is in charge, including dreams. Okay? So now we move on to verses 9 through 15. So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, in my dream, behold, there was a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. And as it was budding, its blossoms came out, and its clusters produced ripe grapes. Now Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, so I took the grapes and squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup. And I put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. Then Joseph said to him, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office. And you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to your former custom when you were his cupbearer. Only keep me in mind when it goes well with you. And please do me a kindness by mentioning me to Pharaoh and get me out of this house. For I was in fact kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I've done nothing that they should have put me into the dungeon. Okay, so with the cupbearer, there was a vine in front of him. Fermented wine was not a common drink for the common person during this time in man's history. It was a drink that basically was reserved for kings and gods. So this is just another indication of how powerful and strong and important Pharaoh is, because he drinks wine, the kingly drink. We find out from this interpretation that the cupbearer is going to be restored after 3 days. Pharaoh is going to lift him up. He's going to exalt him. He's going to put him back into his former position, restore him. Hallelujah. You know, this is some good news. And Joseph says, hey, now I want you to remember, when this happens to you, remember me. I'm still down here in the dungeon. You go back to Pharaoh and you tell him what a good guy I am, and I hadn't done anything wrong, that I was unjustly put here. So get me out of here. Help me out of here. Now I'm going to help you. You know, I've interpreted this dream. Now you go and plead my case before Pharaoh. Okay? That's kind of what he was wanting them to do. And in 15 dungeon that he's in, this could be used to describe the same word that cistern is, which, you know, Joseph started out being in a cistern. His brothers had thrown him in a cistern, and now he's in another cistern. He's in a pit. Okay, he's down in a hole in the ground somewhere under a house, probably. You know, deep dark basement. And I got thinking, why? How do you dig pits in that type of country? You know, that's got to be a hard thing to do, I would think. I mean, you're somewhat familiar with that geography.
Well, but if you're looking right around where Pharaoh would have been, you actually have actual earth rather than
you've got the earth, yeah, you've got the flooding of the Nile.
Because you have the Nile,
building
what's
up
going
the
to
Severn.
the sand is going to be an issue.
Okay.
But still, you'd have to dig pretty far, I would think, so.
You know, I'm just thinking of some of the monuments and some of the pyramids and stuff they built. They had to cart those materials in from huge, hundreds, thousands of miles. So I don't know. But anyway, they had pit, and that's where he was. So now, okay, that's the cupbearer's lot. So let's see what's happening with the baker here. When the chief baker saw that he had interpreted favorably, all right, cupbearer got a good interpretation. I think I'll go for it now. He said to Joseph, I also saw in my dream, and behold, there were 3 baskets of white bread on my head. And in the top basket there was some of all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh. And the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. Then Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and will hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh off of you. Oh, man. I don't think that's what he wanted to hear. They had a custom in Canaan, where the Israelites were located, where Jacob and Abraham and all those guys. But in Canaan, the promised land, the women were the ones who carried the baskets on their head. and carried all the goods in baskets. And in Egypt, it was customary for the men to carry the baskets on the head. And so what this also tells us is this adds to the historical account, that this is a historical account because it's pointing out a difference between the two different cultures. And so it's not just a made-up story, it's actually a recording of someone who actually is aware of the events and familiar with the events, which I thought was an interesting point. And of course, there's all kinds of foods being baked for Pharaoh. This reference back to the 38 kinds of cakes and the 57 types of breads. Now, lift up your head for me on verse 19. In the 13th verse, when they were talking about lifting up the cupbearer's head, that was to lift someone up in order to do them good. And now in verse 19, it means to lift up someone's head in order to cut it off. See, you can't hang somebody if their head's been cut off, so what are they going to do with the head? They're going to impale the head and hang it. Okay? It's a custom at that time. You behead someone, you impale the head, and you put it on the front gate, so everybody can see. That was a custom at that time. And that was the fate of the cupbearer. And of course, if you've got a head impaled, and I'm sorry, but it's Hakuna Matata. If you've got the head sitting out here, well, what's going to happen? The birds are going to come and they're going to eat the flesh off the head. Okay. So anyway, it's a pretty awful way to go. Okay. And so in verses 20 through 23, thus it came about on the third day, which was, it was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all his servants. And he lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his office, and he put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker just as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. So, here again, here's the fulfillment of the interpretation. And here's a failure of the cupbearer to do anything for Joseph. He didn't remember Joseph. At this point, Joseph's got to be feeling that, God's my only resource here. These people aren't listening to me, but God, I got to rely on God because God is the only one who's going to stand by me and going to listen to me. So, wow, what a story. And it was on Pharaoh's birthday. Ooh. What a way to celebrate, huh? I don't know if I would have liked living back in those days. Oh my goodness, it had to be tough. So now let's move on into chapter 41 here. And let's look at the first 8 verses here. Now it happened at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream. And behold, he was standing by the Nile. And lo, from the Nile there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed in the marsh grass. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them from the Nile, ugly and gaunt. And they stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. The ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 sleek and fat cows. Then Pharaoh awoke. He fell asleep and dreamed the second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain came up on a single stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 ears, thin and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up after them. The thin ears swallowed up, the 7 plump and full ears. Then Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Now in the morning his spirit was troubled, so he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them to Pharaoh. So in the first verse, at the end of 2 full years, 2 full years from what? 2 full years from the birthday party. Joseph is still in his horrible circumstance. He's still in the dungeon. And this is after 2 full years. So at this point, Joseph has been in jail for 13 years maybe? He came to Egypt when he was 17, and then he achieved a position of authority when he was 30. So there's 13 years in here somewhere, okay, that he spent in prison in Egypt. That's a long time. And this 2 years that we're talking about here is within that 13-year period, okay? When we look at the term Pharaoh, maybe we should be saying the Pharaoh, like we say president and the president, because it might not be the same person. It's the same office. It's the same position, but it might be a different person in that position or in that office, which is going to be important to see here in a moment, because we're going to see some recounting of some tales as if Pharaoh was not aware of previous history. And this would explain why Pharaoh was not aware of previous history, because it might be a different man in that position, which, if he's a god, he died. Oops. Oh well. I don't know. Not a very strong one. But anyway, he had this dream, and in Egypt and Mesopotamia at this time, they had magicians and they had wise men, and dream interpretation was a really big deal in their culture and in their religion. And it's real interesting that the two Hebrews in the Old Testament who were involved with interpreting dreams worked for pagan kings. You know, Daniel worked for pagan king, and Joseph worked for pagan king. And it's interesting that God has placed them in the circumstance in their time to be able to interpret the dreams for the pagans. God has placed His people in the midst of pagans in order to give them an interpretation. That's interesting. That's an important point. God's providing the pagans some understanding of how things are. So, and when we look at the Nile has its annual flood and brings prosperity and builds up the sediment, makes the grounds fertile, provides irrigation for all of the crops. The Nile itself was considered to be a god that needed to be appeased. You had to provide offerings to the Nile. It was a god. Interesting. So there were 7 cows, and Plutarch, who was a Roman historian, tells us that cows were symbols of prosperity in that day and time. They symbolized the bounty of the earth in Egypt. The cow was the main herd animal in Egypt, where with the Hebrews, the main herd animal were the sheep. So it's kind of like range wars, the Wild West. You got the cattle ranchers, and you got the sheep herders, and you got this strip of land here that has water on it, and who's going to get it? And so, the Egyptians at this point had it going on with cattle. They were very wealthy. And we're going to see in a little while that the Hebrews weren't doing real good with famine and with watering their sheep and making a living. We'll find that out in a little bit. So these cows were fat and sassy cows. They were grazing in the marsh grass. A lot of cattle go down into the pond. We're all living in Missouri. We've all seen farm ponds, and the cows sit in the farm. Well, they go in there to cool off. They go in there to keep the insects off, because if you're under the water, the flies can't bother you. And then they go in there because, hey, that's where the lush grass is. You find some good grass around the edge of the water there, because it's always got moisture, and it's going to be nice and juicy and sweet grass. So, that's probably why the cows were going down to the Nile. Now, you look at the cows in verses 3 and 4. And that's a different kind of cow. These cows are starving. These cows are in need. And they come along, and what do? What do the cows do in verses 3 and 4? What do those cows do? They ate up all the profit. Yeah. Something's happening here. The hungry cows take over and destroy the healthy cows. So the second dream, and we find it's repetitious, but instead of cows, we're talking about grain. And so this dream is talking about, pardon me, it's talking about the bounty of Egypt. You know, it's livestock, Egypt's grain. Something's going to be happening to the bounty of Egypt here. When we look at wind, this desert wind, y'all remember that Volkswagen called a Sirocco? It was back in the 70s, folks, okay? Volkswagen came out with this really fast car called a Sirocco. Why did they call it a Sirocco? Because the name for that is wind. Wind from the east. That's what this desert wind is. It's a Sirocco. That's an Arabic word. Okay? And there's another kind of wind called a Khamsin wind, which also comes from the southeast. The main point being, hello, Brother Isaac. We're in Genesis 41 here. The main point being that these desert winds, or furious winds, are going to come up, and as a result of these winds, the bounty of Egypt is going to be destroyed. Okay? So we look in verse 8 that his spirit was troubled. Spirit is, the word for spirit here is wind or breath, or spirit, and it denotes the life force. Okay? So this is a great impact. It's gonna impact the life force. It makes him troubled. Okay, it's disturbing his very being. Okay, in verse 8, the magicians of Egypt. These men were the readers and the practitioners and the writers of the ancient books concerning divination, interpretations, and that kind of stuff. And then in verse 8, the wise men, these were different people. These were like the court counselors. And these weren't necessarily the priestly class of soothsayers, such as the magicians. These were just guys that kind of hung around the court, and they were just, you could bounce stuff off of them, and they would give wise counsel. Okay? But there weren't any of them that can interpret these dreams. Okay? Which is interesting because in Daniel, you saw Nebuchadnezzar's in Mesopotamia, his wise men and his magicians all interpreted everything incorrectly. Okay, they were dishonest. They had to interpret because they saw that as their lot in life. Even if it wasn't right, they were going to give you an answer. Okay. Well, in Pharaoh's court, I don't know. I'm kind of looking at the cupbearer, and I'm kind of looking at the baker. And if I give a wrong answer to Pharaoh, if I give a right answer, I'm going to be like the cupbearer. I'm going to be exalted. I'm going to be rewarded. Everything's going to be fine. But if I give a wrong answer, my fate might be like the baker, and I might get my head chopped off and put on a pole outside the front gate. So, there's some people say, well, Pharaoh's magicians were more honest. I don't know if they were more honest. I think they were more wanting to save their own rear ends. I don't know. Because if the result of a bad answer is you die, I don't think I'm going to give an answer. That must be a hard place to work. I don't know, man. Gee whiz. But we find that Joseph, he's got the Lord with him. He's got God, so he steps up. And we're going to see that he's going to interpret some dreams here. So anyway, in verses 9 through 13, the chief cupbearer spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I would make mention today of my own offenses. Pharaoh was furious with his servants, and he put me in confinement in the house of the captain of the bodyguard, both me and the chief baker. We had a dream on the same night, he and I. Each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now a Hebrew youth was there with us, a servant of the captain of the bodyguard. And we related them to him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each one he interpreted according to his own dream. And just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me in my office, but he hanged him. So he's recounting the story to Pharaoh. Now, this is why we think we might have a different Pharaoh here, because the other Pharaoh would have been very familiar with this. But this was 2 years ago, okay? And it's real interesting that in a time of need, the cupbearer, oh yeah, there's this Hebrew guy down in the dungeon, the guy that asked me to bring his case before Pharaoh. Well, I'm remembering him now because I have a need. You know, for 2 years I haven't had a need, so I haven't brought anything to Pharaoh about this Hebrew guy. But now that I have a need, I remember this guy. So, you know, we've got some pretty selfish stuff going on here. So Pharaoh sent and called for Joseph. We're reading verses 14 through 24 now. Sent and called for Joseph, and they hurriedly brought him out of the dungeon. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, but no one can interpret it. And I've just heard about you, that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph then answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. So Pharaoh spoke to Joseph. In my dream, behold, I was standing on the bank of the Nile, and behold, 7. So he relates the dream again that he had about 7 fat cows, the 7 sleek cows, the 7 full grains, stocked with grains, and then the empty stalks that came and withered the 7 good ones. So in verse 14, they hurriedly brought him out of the dungeon. So, you know, he's still in there with the political prisoners. He's been in there quite a time. He shaved himself and changed his clothes. This was an Egyptian custom that when you went to be in the court, when you went to be around Pharaoh, you shaved your head, you shaved your body, you scraped all the hair off of you. It was a form of cleansing. It was how you cleanse him, which is another indication that the Egyptians considered Pharaoh to be part of Ray's God, the sun god family. And then Joseph says, hey, you know, I'm not the one that's going to give you the answer. God is going to give you the answer. So Joseph knew that he was not the source, but God was the source. There is a slight difference in 17 through 24. It seems like Pharaoh is kind of embellishing the dream a little bit. But a reason for doing that could be, you know, how many of us here have gone fishing and caught a fish? And when we talk about our fishing or our hunting experience, the tale changes a little bit. You know, kind of human nature that the more times you tell the story, the more opportunity you have to change it. And that's possibly what was going on here. Genesis 41, verses 25 through 36. Now Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dreams are one and the same. God has told Pharaoh what he's about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one and the same. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 thin ears scorched by the east wind will be 7 years of famine. It is as I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. Behold, 7 years of great abundance are coming in all the land of Egypt, and after them 7 years of famine will come, and all the abundance will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will ravage the land. So the abundance will be unknown in the land because of the subsequent famine, for it will be very severe. Now, as for the repeating of the dream to Pharaoh twice, it means that the matter is determined by God, and God will quickly bring it about. Now let Pharaoh look for a man discerning and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh take action to appoint overseers in charge of the land, and let him exact a fifth of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 years of abundance. Then let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and store up the grain for food in the cities under Pharaoh's authority, and let them guard it. Let the food become as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine, which will occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land will not perish during the famine. So Joseph's got some really good ideas here, you know. The word that Joseph uses for God, he doesn't use the name Yahweh, because Pharaoh wouldn't recognize that name, but he does use the word Elohim, which Pharaoh would recognize as a word for God. So Joseph is making a distinction for Pharaoh that this is the God. This isn't one of your gods. This is the God. This is my God. Okay? Very important thing to note. He's identifying God for Pharaoh. Okay? This whole thing, God has given Pharaoh a dream, a warning. You're going to have 7 really good years and you're going to have 7 really bad years. And then Joseph interprets this and suggests that, hey, get somebody out there to start storing up some excess. You know, we got to get ourselves through the... God is making a way to provide for a pagan. God cares about the pagans. The Egyptians are not God's people, but God is making provisions. Now, in making the provisions for the pagans, we're going to find out in the next chapter and beyond that the Egyptians were instrumental in helping God's people. Okay? But God is making a plan for the nations here, because it's not just the Egyptians that are going to be affected by this, it's going to be all of the nations. And it's basically a worldwide famine you're going to get. So all of the nations are going to be affected. So God is making plans and provisions to take care of all of the nations, if only they will listen. Okay? So, this is a matter determined by God. God is in control of nature. Sometimes nature just runs its course, and God lets nature run its course, and God is saying, this is what nature is going to do. And so Joseph gives his wise understanding of what they can do. And I just find it interesting that God is making a provision to take care of the world. You know, just as He does today. You know, everybody has a way of salvation. You know, everybody has the opportunity to rely upon the Lord God, Jesus Christ. So it's out there. He was doing it way back when too. So in Genesis 41, verses 37 through 45, we see, now the proposal seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his servants. Then Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this in whom is a divine spirit? So Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has informed you of all of this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house. And according to your command, all my people shall do you homage. Only in the throne I will be greater than you. Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took off his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand and clothed him in the garments of fine linen and put the gold necklace around his neck. He had him ride in his second chariot, and they proclaimed before him, bow the knee. And he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, though I am Pharaoh, yet without your permission no one shall raise his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. Wow. Then Pharaoh named Joseph Zaphanath-Paneah, and he gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, as his wife. And Joseph went forth over the land of Egypt. Wow. Okay, the 13 years in the dungeon are gone, finally. So Joseph is about 30 years old now, right? Came when he was 17, spent 13 years in prison, got to be about 30. Pharaoh recognizes that there's a divine spirit about Joseph. Joseph has something spiritually that other people don't have. Pharaoh, in his talking about the divine spirit and about God, uses the same name that Joseph used. He's not using an Egyptian God's name. He's using the Lord God's name. So Pharaoh is kind of acknowledging that there's a God out there in his own way. Joseph is very powerful now. He's second in command. He's the only person greater than he in all land is Pharaoh. So he's ruling over everybody. He's a grand vizier. Is kind of what his title is. He's Pharaoh's right-hand man. He has all of the authority that Pharaoh has. He's got the signet ring. He's got the necklace. He's got the fine. The only one who has anything more than him is Pharaoh. Everybody's bowing down to him. No one shall raise his hand or foot. This is interesting in 44. When you raise your hand or foot, that refers to going to work. Nobody's going to do any kind of work unless Joseph authorizes it. Joseph is in charge of all the construction. He's in charge of all of the efforts for the grain, you can't do anything without Joseph's permission. Okay? And then to top it off, he gets a new wife. Asenath, the meaning of that name is belongs to Nia, the love goddess of the Egyptians. And so he has become an elite member of Egyptian society. He gets the daughter of a high priest, who is also named after the love goddess of the Egyptians. You don't get a more worthy wife than that in that culture, in that society. And so we see in verse 45, Joseph gained authority over all of the land of Egypt. He traveled all over the land, and he was in charge. So in verses 46 through 49, Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh, went through all the land of Egypt. So they went through 7 years of plenty, okay? And they were storing the food and making plans. And then in verses 50 and 52, now before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. He named the second Ephraim, for he said, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Manasseh is related to a verb that means to forget. So if you name your son that you're forgetting something, that means you're still remembering it. Because you have to remember it in order to forget it. So he still remembers what his brothers did to him. And we'll find out in the next chapter that, he still remembers. Ephraim is related to a term that means fruitfulness or double fruit, a time of plenty. Ephraim's people become half-tribes who are going to inherit Joseph's double portion. Joseph is going to get a double portion of some goods, and Ephraim and his tribes are going to get half of it. So, verses 53 through 57, when the 7 years of plenty which had been in the land of Egypt came to an end, 7 years of famine began to come. There was famine, and then what had happened was the people were hungry, and so they were signing over their land in order to get food from Pharaoh's storehouses. And so Pharaoh gobbled up all the land of Egypt. Nobody owned anything. He owned it all. Because in order for them to survive, they signed away their land. And many nations came to Egypt for assistance. And that's how Pharaoh was able to gain a lot of land mass for Egypt. So now we're moving into chapter 42, verses 1 through 5. Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt, and Jacob said to his sons, "Why are you staring at one another?" Remember that. Why are you staring at one another? I thought that was kind of odd when I saw it placed there. He said, "Behold, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us from that place so that we may live and not die." Then 10 brothers of Joseph went down to buy grain from Egypt, but Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he said, I am afraid that harm may befall him. So the sons of Israel came to buy grain among those who were coming, for the famine was in the land of Canaan also. Like I said, it was a region-wide, if not worldwide famine. So Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt and said, "Why are you staring at one another?" Well, did he see it in a vision and they were astounded that he saw it in a vision? Or did he see that other people were going to Egypt and buying grain? Who knows? But in any case, the brothers, I think, were saying, uh-oh, the old man knows that there's grain in Egypt, and they kind of look at each other like, we might have to go to Egypt. Uh-oh. Maybe that's why they were staring at each other. Which indeed in verse 2, Jacob says, hey, I'll go to Egypt. Now, Jacob still didn't trust his sons. And we know this because he held back. He kept Benjamin with him. And then he also said that something about harm. Okay? He didn't want any harm to befall him. It's like, he might think something bad's going to happen. Like maybe he thought something bad happened to Joseph because of his brothers. I don't know. So anyway, he holds Benjamin back. So the sons of Israel went down to Egypt, and why did all of them go? Well, maybe each person could only buy so much grain, so you needed a lot of people to go to buy a lot of grain. Or you're traveling a distance, so maybe, and you're going to be carrying a valuable commodity, so maybe there's safety in numbers. You want to send as many people as you can. In Genesis 42, 6 through 7, Joseph was the ruler over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land, and Joseph's brothers came and bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. When Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them. But he disguised himself to them and spoke to them harshly. And he said to them, "Where have you come from?" And they said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." Okay, so in Genesis 37, 6 through 9, we saw where Joseph's brothers in a dream were going to bow down to him. Okay, fulfillment of that dream, they're bowing down to him now. And they do it again in chapter 43, and they do it again in chapter 44. So that seemed to come true. Now he recognized them. I mean, they were in their regular clothes, and he probably recognized their family features, and he understood their language. Of course, here he is with a shaved head, wearing all these fine garments and stuff, and he's speaking Egyptian. He's using an interpreter, so he knows what they're saying, but they don't know that he knows because he's using an interpreter. And he spoke to them harshly and kind of giving them the idea that he thought they were spies. So they're getting kind of paranoid now because, oh man, this guy that we want to buy grain from, he thinks we're spies. Okay, so they're getting a bit paranoid here. Joseph is kind of doing a little payback here, I think. He's kind of having a little fun with it. Joseph had recognized his brothers, although they did not recognize him. Joseph remembered the dreams which he had about them and said to them, "You are spies. You have come to look at the undefended parts of our land." Then they said to him, "No, my lord, but your servants have come to buy food. We are all sons of one man. We are honest men. Your servants are not spies." Yet he said to them, "No, but you have come to look at the undefended parts of our land." But they said, "Your servants are 12 brothers in all, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. And behold, the youngest is with our father today, and one is no longer alive." And Joseph said to them, "It is as I said to you, you are spies. By this you will be tested. By the life of Pharaoh you shall not go from this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you that he may get your brother while you remain confined, that your words may be tested, whether there is truth in you. But if not, by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies." So he put them all together in prison for 3 days. Wow. So Joseph's remembering this flood of memories that he had 13 years ago with all of this going on. He accuses him of being spies. One thing that may have led to this is Jacob may have told his sons that, if you show up as a group, they're going to know you're a group and they're not going to want to sell you much grain because they're going to see you as one unit. So why don't y'all split up? Some of y'all go in through this gate, some of y'all go in through that gate, some of y'all go there, and that way it won't look like you're all together and you'll be able to buy more grain. But Joseph used this information to kind of twist it and say, you're acting like spies. Y'all are bank robbers. Y'all split up and came into town in a different route. So, Joseph, pretty smart guy. And he's accusing them of being spies because he's wanting to test their character. He's wanting to test and see, who are they? Are my brothers, are they somebody who's worthy of redemption, basically? Do they have strong character? Am I going to be able to trust them? If they say they're honest men, Joseph's going, yeah, right. You sold me. You didn't tell me you're honest men. I don't think so. They may have been upright men, but they acted in some evil ways in the past. Joseph swears by the life of Pharaoh, instead of by the life of God, and by the name of God. And this may have just been part of his act. Some people have criticized Joseph for swearing by the life of Pharaoh because they see it as a sin. But maybe, he's just playing the part of an administrator in the land of Egypt. He doesn't want to blow his cover. So there's some controversy about that. Just thought I'd throw that out there. So he put him in prison for 3 days. Hey, you're going to experience a little bit of what I experienced. So Joseph said to them on the 3rd day, do this and live, for I fear God. If you're honest men, let one of your brothers be confined in your prison, but as for the rest of you, go carry grain for the famine of your households, and bring your youngest brother to me, so your words may be verified, and you will not die. And they did so. Then they said to one another, truly we are guilty concerning our brother, because we saw the distress of his soul when he pleaded with us, yet we would not listen. Therefore this distress has come upon us. Reuben answered them, saying, did I not tell you, do not sin against the boy, and you would not listen? Now comes the reckoning for his blood. And they did not know, however, that Joseph understood, for there was an interpreter between them. He turned away from them and wept. But when he returned to them and spoke to them, he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. Then Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain and to restore every man's money in his sack, and to give them provisions for the journey. And thus it was done for them. Okay? So, Joseph is able to hear his brothers talking about the awful way that they had treated him. And this is probably the first and only time he heard Reuben stick up for him. Because he hears Reuben tell the other guys, hey, didn't I tell you we shouldn't do this? But y'all went ahead and did it anyway, and now we're going to pay the consequences. Okay? They felt that they were being punished because of their sin against Joseph. Okay? And so it is a natural consequence. They've been found out, so they're going to receive the punishment. It's a sense of you reap what you sow. They're getting their just reward. And the one thing we have to keep in mind is, we do get a lot of just rewards. We do receive consequences for our sin in this world. But thank God we don't receive all of the consequences and don't receive all of the judgment for our sin, because we'd all be dead right now. God would have to strike us down, because there's no one who hadn't sinned and who deserves death in God's eyes. So this is just an indicator of God's grace and mercy being extended even to his people, even at this time. So Joseph wept. He was, feeling really bad about everything going on. He had feelings. So let's move on to 26 through 28 in chapter 42. So they loaded their donkeys with their grain and departed from there. And as one of them opened his sack to give his donkey fodder at the lodging place, he saw his money, and behold, it was in the mouth of the sack. Then he said to his brothers, my money's been returned, and behold, it's even in my sack. And their hearts sank. And they turned trembling to one another, saying, what is this that God has done to us? So they're getting kind of scared now because it looks like maybe they shouldn't have this money and how they got this money. And this is a sign that they're not going to be accepted and that there's going to be some further consequences. They're feeling a lot of guilt right now for what they had previously done to Joseph. And they're feeling like God's getting ready to just, give them a really big payback. When they came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan, they told him all that had happened to them, saying, "The man, the Lord of the land, spoke harshly with us and took us for spies of the country. So we said to him, 'We're honest men. We're not spies. We're 12 brothers, sons of our father. One is no longer alive, and the youngest is with our father today.' So then, he told us to take this grain and come back with the youngest son, and they would release Simeon, and we could go on our way." So they tell everything that happened, and in verses 35 through 38, we see, "Now it came about as they were emptying their sacks, behold, every man's bundle of money was in his sack. When they and their father saw the bundles of money, they were dismayed. Their father Jacob said to them, 'You have bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and you would take Benjamin. All these things are against me.' Then Reuben spoke to his father, saying, 'You may put my 2 sons to death if I do not bring him back to you. Put him in my care, and I will return him to you.' But Jacob said, 'My son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he alone is left. If harm should befall him on the journey you are taking, then you will bring my gray hair down to Sheol in sorrow.'" So all of them had their money returned. They're saying, "Oh, we're in deep trouble now." And Jacob's going, "Wow, you guys, I've already lost one son, and I've got another son that's in jail down there. We're not going to get him out. You want me to take my youngest son?" And no, this isn't a good plan, guys. You've caused me all these troubles. And Jacob's taking everything kind of personally right now. These things are happening. He's implying that the sons have brought all this upon the family by their action. Reuben makes an interesting offer. "Look, if I don't bring your son back, you can kill my 2 sons. Okay, you can trade your son for your 2 grandsons' lives. It's all family, so I don't know. Seemed kind of interesting offer. And it just kind of shows you the desperation of their thought processes that were going on here. They want to get their brother. They want to, have free trade. They want to be able to go back and trade more. The famine might last for a while, but they can't do anything without their father releasing Benjamin so they can take Benjamin back. And so basically we end this chapter with Jacob saying, "Y'all are going to drive me to the grave. I don't know what to do with y'all. You're going to drive me to the grave." So the story gets even hotter next week. It intensifies. It gets a little better. Thank you for your attention this morning. We'll go ahead and close in prayer. Father God, we thank you for this time we've had this morning. We ask that we would retain the words and the message that you would have us learn from these chapters that we went through this morning, Lord. Thank you for the faithfulness of those that are here this morning. Be with Ed as he brings the message, and with Adam as he leads us in music and worship, Lord. We thank you for this day. In Christ's name, amen.